Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the leather boots of medieval Europe's most feared and necessary professional, the town executioner. Picture this. It's dawn in 1347, and you're waking up in a small stone cottage on the outskirts of town, where the church bells are already tolling the hour, and your stomach is nodding, because today's schedule includes 3 beheadings, a hanging, and if the rumors are true, a rather unpleasant affair involving a suspected witch and some very hot iron. You probably won't survive the psychological trauma of what you're about to witness. But hey, somebody's got to keep medieval justice rolling along, right? The morning light filters through your single window, casting long shadows across the rough wooden floor where your tools of the trade gleam with yesterday's careful polishing. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love hearing from night owls and insomniacs around the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The rooster's crow mingles with those persistent church bells, and you roll over on your straw mattress, feeling the familiar weight of dread settling in your chest like a stone. Your name is Master Wilhelm, though most people just call you the headsman or whisper executioner when they think you can't hear. Historians still argue whether medieval executioners were universally despised or grudgingly respected. But one thing's certain, you're definitely not invited to many dinner parties. Your cottage sits deliberately apart from the main town, close enough for officials to summon you, but far enough that respectable families don't have to see your daily comings and goings. The isolation suits you well enough. It's hard to make small talk with neighbors when your profession involves separating heads from shoulders on a regular basis. The wooden chest beside your bed contains your most precious possessions, not gold or jewels, but perfectly balanced axes, razor-sharp swords, and coiled ropes that could snap a neck cleaner than a wishbone at Christmas dinner. You swing your legs over the side of the bed, bare feet touching cold stone, and immediately your mind turns to today's roster. 3 condemned men await your services: a horse thief who'll meet the noose, a murderer destined for the headsman's block, and a counterfeiter whose punishment involves some creative metalwork that would make a blacksmith wince. The 4th case, the suspected witch, remains uncertain, pending the results of yesterday's trial by ordeal. Medieval justice moved at its own peculiar pace, somewhere between a funeral march and a drunken stumble. The morning air carries the scent of wood smoke and something less pleasant. The town's waste management system leaves much to be desired, and you've learned to breathe through your mouth during certain wind directions. You pad across the floor to your wash basin, splashing cold water on your face and wondering, not for the first time, how you ended up in this particular line of work. Your father was a blacksmith. Your brother became a baker. But somehow, you inherited the family talent for steady hands and strong stomachs, qualities that proved surprisingly marketable in medieval law enforcement. The The official summons arrived yesterday afternoon, delivered by a nervous page who wouldn't meet your eyes, and practically threw the scroll through your door before scampering away like a startled rabbit. The parchment outlined today's proceedings with bureaucratic precision. Executions to commence at the 9th hour. Public attendance expected. Bring your own tools, and don't forget the ceremonial hood. Medieval record-keeping was surprisingly thorough when it came to judicial killings. Apparently, even death required proper paperwork. You stretch your arms above your head, feeling the familiar ache in your shoulders from yesterday's practice swings. Maintaining your skills requires constant work. There's no room for hesitation or clumsiness when hundreds of people are watching, and the condemned man's life hangs in the balance. A clean, quick death is both a professional requirement and a moral obligation, though historians still argue whether medieval executioners were motivated more by craftsmanship or compassion. The cottage's single room serves all your needs: sleeping, eating, tool maintenance, and the occasional attempt at normal human activities like reading or whittling. Your book collection consists mainly of religious texts and a surprisingly comprehensive manual on human anatomy knowledge that proves disturbingly relevant in your line of work. The whittling usually produces small wooden crosses, which you leave anonymously at the graves of your victims. It's a private ritual that helps you sleep slightly better, though the nightmares never completely fade. Outside your window, the town is slowly awakening. Merchants are setting up their stalls in the marketplace, completely ignoring the wooden scaffold that stands permanently erected in the center square like some grim monument to medieval justice. Children will play around its base later, turning instruments of death into playground equipment with the casual resilience that only kids possess. Their parents will watch nervously, torn between protecting their innocence and preparing them for the harsh realities of 14th century life. You move to the wooden chest that houses your professional equipment, lifting the heavy lid with the reverence of a priest approaching an altar. The tools inside represent years of careful acquisition and meticulous maintenance, each piece selected for its specific purpose and kept in perfect condition through daily attention. Your primary axe, forged by the finest blacksmith in the neighboring county, gleams with a mirror finish that reflects your face in distorted fragments. The blade's edge could split a hair lengthwise, though you sincerely hope today's work won't require such precision. Medieval executioners were surprisingly well compensated for their services, earning more than most craftsmen and receiving additional payments for each execution performed. The town council understood that quality work required quality tools, and they were willing to invest in equipment that would ensure swift, clean deaths that satisfied both legal requirements and public expectations. Your collection includes specialized swords for beheading nobility. Apparently, even in death, social class demanded appropriate accommodations, and a variety of ropes calibrated for different body weights and neck thicknesses. Morning routine begins with inspection and sharpening, a meditative process that helps calm your nerves while ensuring professional readiness. You run your thumb carefully along each blade's edge, feeling for the microscopic nicks and dulling that could mean the difference between a clean execution and a butchered nightmare. The whetstone whispers against steel as you work, each stroke bringing the metal closer to that perfect sharpness that makes death swift and hopefully painless. Historians still argue whether medieval executioners took pride in their craft or simply endured it as a necessary evil, but the evidence suggests a complex mixture of both attitudes. Your tools represent significant financial investment and countless hours of practice. Nobody maintains equipment this obsessively without caring about the results. Yet, the work itself weighs heavily on anyone with a functioning conscience, creating a psychological tension that few other professions could match. The counterfeiter's punishment will require your branding irons, currently resting in the coals of your small fireplace, where they'll heat to the precise temperature needed for marking flesh without causing excessive tissue damage. Medieval justice aimed for punishment that would serve as both deterrent and permanent identification. A scarred forehead or branded hand announced the bearer's crimes to everyone they met for the rest of their lives. The irony wasn't lost on you that counterfeiting money carried penalties that were often more severe than murder. But then again, medieval priorities sometimes defied modern logic. Your ceremonial hood hangs on a wooden peg near the door, its black fabric worn smooth by years of use and countless washings that never quite remove the smell of fear and death. The hood serves multiple purposes. It maintains your anonymity, adds theatrical drama to the proceedings, and provides psychological distance between your personal identity and your professional duties. Some executioners worked unmasked, but you prefer the anonymity. It makes trips to the market slightly less awkward when people can't immediately recognize you as the town's official killer. The rope selection requires careful consideration based on each condemned person's physical characteristics. Too thick, and the noose won't tighten properly. Too thin, and it might cut through the neck rather than breaking it cleanly. Your collection includes hemp ropes of various diameters, each tested for tensile strength and flexibility. Medieval hanging was considered more merciful than many alternatives, but only when performed correctly. A botched execution could leave the victim dangling and choking for agonizing minutes, while the crowd grew increasingly restless. You select today's implements with the methodical care of a surgeon choosing scalpels, though your patients won't survive the procedure regardless of your skill level. The murderer will require the heavy execution sword, its two-handed grip designed for delivering the devastating blow needed to sever a human neck in a single stroke. Practice swings with a wooden post have taught you the precise angle and force required. Knowledge gained through repetition rather than formal training, medieval professional development was largely a do-it-yourself affair. The witch trial's outcome remains uncertain, but you prepare the relevant equipment just in case. Trial by ordeal was giving way to more conventional legal procedures, but suspected witchcraft cases still occasionally demanded the older methods. Your collection includes the implements needed for various tests: iron rods for hot metal ordeals, weights for water trials, and other specialized tools that medieval justice employed in its ongoing battle against supernatural crime. Historians still argue whether these methods reflected genuine belief in their effectiveness or simply provided legal cover for predetermined outcomes. Morning sun climbs higher as you complete your preparations, each tool cleaned, sharpened, and arranged in the leather satchel that will accompany you to the scaffold. Your hands move with practiced efficiency, but your mind wanders to the faces you'll see today, not just the condemned, but the crowd that will gather to witness medieval justice in action. Children will watch wide-eyed as their first execution unfolds, while adults will cheer or weep depending on their relationship to the victims and the crimes involved. The town bells chime the hour, reminding you that time moves forward regardless of your personal feelings about the day's agenda. Professional duty demands punctuality, and the assembled crowd expects their entertainment to begin on schedule. You shoulder your equipment bag, adjust your hood, and step toward the door, leaving behind the relative peace of your cottage for the public spectacle that awaits in the town square. You step outside into the crisp morning air, immediately noticing how the usual sounds of town life seem muffled and subdued. Execution days always cast a strange spell over the community, part anticipation and part dread. The cobblestone streets that normally echo with merchants hawking their wares and children playing now carry a different energy, as if the very stones understand that death is scheduled to visit before noon. Your leather boots click against the uneven pavement as you make your way toward the town center, carrying your tools of the trade in a worn canvas sack that draws nervous glances from early risers. The baker's wife crosses herself as you pass, a reflexive gesture that you've grown accustomed to over the years. Medieval society maintained a complex relationship with executioners, simultaneously necessary and reviled, respected for their skill, yet shunned for their profession. You nod politely to those brave enough to make eye contact, though most people suddenly find their shoes fascinating when you appear in their peripheral vision. It's like being a walking reminder of mortality, which probably explains why dinner party invitations are so rare in your line of work. Medieval towns were surprisingly compact, and your journey to the execution site takes you through the heart of daily life. Past the blacksmith's forge, where apprentices are already stoking the morning fires, around the baker's shop, where fresh loaves create aromatic clouds that almost mask the underlying smell of medieval sanitation, and through the market square, where vendors are setting up stalls that will compete for attention with today's public spectacle. The juxtaposition never fails to strike you: life and death, commerce and justice, all existing within a few hundred yards of each other. The scaffold stands in the center of the main square, its dark wooden timbers weathered by countless executions and public punishments. Medieval civic planning placed these structures prominently, ensuring maximum visibility for what authorities hoped would serve as effective deterrents to criminal behavior. platform rises about 4 feet above the cobblestones, providing clear sightlines for the assembled crowd, while elevating the proceedings to something approaching theatrical drama. A permanent fixture in most towns, scaffolds represented the state's power to dispense final justice, though historians still argue whether their deterrent effect outweighed their potential for encouraging violence. Early spectators are already claiming prime viewing positions despite the hour, spreading blankets and unpacking meals, as if preparing for a particularly morbid festival. Medieval executions were major social events that brought together all levels of society. Nobles occupied elevated seating areas, while commoners pressed forward for the best ground-level views. The atmosphere resembled a county fair, crossed with a religious service, complete with vendors selling food and trinkets, alongside priests offering last-minute spiritual guidance to anyone who'd listen. Children dart between adult legs, their excitement palpable despite their parents' attempts to maintain appropriate solemnity. You remember your own first execution as a spectator, probably around age 7, when your father lifted you onto his shoulders so you could see over the crowd. Medieval childhood included exposure to death and violence that would horrify modern parents, but contemporary society viewed these experiences as necessary education in the harsh realities of justice and consequence. The kids will probably have nightmares tonight, but they'll also understand that actions carry serious repercussions. The town's official crier stands near the scaffold, periodically announcing the morning's schedule to anyone within earshot. His voice carries across the square with practiced authority, listing crimes and punishments with the same tone he might use for market prices or weather reports. Medieval bureaucracy had its own peculiar rhythms, and public executions required as much administrative coordination as military campaigns or royal visits. Someone had to organize the crowd, coordinate with religious authorities, and ensure that all legal requirements were properly fulfilled. A group of traveling merchants has positioned their wagon to provide elevated seating for paying customers, demonstrating the entrepreneurial spirit that medieval commerce brought to every conceivable situation. Death was profitable business, apparently, though you suppose that's always been true throughout human history. The wagon's occupants wear fine clothes and carry themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to purchasing premium experiences, even when those experiences involve watching fellow humans die violent deaths. The condemned men's families cluster near the scaffold's base, their faces showing the complex mixture of grief, shame, and desperate hope that characterizes these gatherings. Medieval justice often punished entire families through social stigma and economic hardship, making executions community-wide traumas rather than individual punishments. You've learned to avoid eye contact with relatives. Your role requires professional detachment, and personal connections only make the work more difficult than it already is. Religious officials move through the crowd, offering spiritual comfort and reminding spectators of their own mortality, though their effectiveness varies considerably depending on individual piety and blood alcohol levels. Medieval executions always included significant religious components, partly from genuine spiritual concern, and partly because church approval legitimized state violence in the eyes of the faithful. The priests will offer final rites to the condemned and prayers for their souls, creating a ceremonial framework that transforms legal killing into something approaching sacred ritual. You approach the scaffold steps, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes following your movement. The wooden platform creaks under your boots as you climb, each step bringing you closer to the moment when theory becomes practice and preparation transforms into action. The crowd's murmur shifts to expectant silence as you arrange your tools with ceremonial precision, every movement calculated to maintain the drama and authority that effective executions require. Morning sun has climbed high enough to cast sharp shadows across the platform, creating stark contrasts between light and darkness that seem symbolically appropriate for the day's events. You adjust your hood, check your equipment one final time, and signal to the guards that you're ready to receive the first condemned prisoner. The crowd presses forward in anticipation, and somewhere in the distance, church bells begin tolling the hour that will mark the beginning of medieval justice's latest performance. You descend from the scaffold to meet the town guards, who are escorting the first prisoner from the dungeon beneath the courthouse, a journey that brings you face to face with the human reality behind today's legal abstractions. The stone steps leading down to the holding cells are worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic, each depression representing countless condemned souls who made this same final walk. The dungeon's atmosphere hits you immediately, dampness that seeps into your bones, the acrid smell of unwashed bodies and human waste, and an oppressive darkness that even flickering torches can't fully dispel. Medieval dungeons were engineered more for containment than comfort, with thick stone walls that muffled screams and iron bars that turned men into caged animals. The first prisoner, Thomas the horse thief, sits hunched in the corner of his cell, his clothes torn and filthy from 3 weeks of incarceration. Horse theft was considered a particularly serious crime in medieval society because it threatened both transportation and agricultural productivity. Stealing a farmer's horse could mean the difference between survival and starvation for an entire family. The punishment reflected this economic reality, though looking at Thomas now, you can't help wondering if the cure might be worse than the disease. "Time to go, Thomas," you say quietly, your voice echoing off the stone walls with an authority that even condemned men respect. Your role as executioner carries certain ceremonial responsibilities, including the formal notification of impending death and the maintenance of dignity throughout the final proceedings. Thomas looks up with eyes that have already accepted their fate. 3 weeks in medieval dungeons tend to break men's spirits long before they reach the scaffold. Historians still argue whether this psychological preparation was intentionally cruel or accidentally merciful, but but the effect remains the same either way. The guards unlock Thomas's cell with keys that probably weigh more than modern smartphones, though they're considerably less entertaining and significantly more final in their implications. Medieval metalworking produced locks that were both beautiful and terrifyingly effective, with mechanisms that could secure doors for centuries if properly maintained. Thomas stands slowly, his legs shaky from weeks of inactivity and poor nutrition, and extends his hands for the ceremonial binding that protocol requires. The rope that will soon break his neck currently serves to secure his wrists, irony that medieval justice never seemed to notice or care about. The second prisoner, Marcus the murderer, occupies a cell deeper in the dungeon's maze, reserved for the most serious criminals who required extra security and isolation. His crime involved killing a merchant during a robbery gone wrong, transforming simple theft into capital murder, and earning him a date with your heaviest sword. Medieval law made clear distinctions between different types of homicide, with premeditated murder receiving the harshest punishments available. Marcus has used his incarceration time to find religion, clutching a wooden cross and muttering prayers in Latin that probably contain more hope than actual theological accuracy. "I'm ready to meet my Maker," Marcus announces with the fervent conviction of a recent convert, though his trembling hands suggest that his spiritual confidence might not extend to his physical courage. Medieval prisoners often experienced dramatic religious conversions while awaiting execution, though historians still argue whether these represented genuine spiritual awakening or desperate psychological coping mechanisms. Either way, the Church encouraged these developments as beneficial for both individual souls and public morale. Dying penitents provided better moral lessons than defiant criminals. The third prisoner, Edmund the counterfeiter, presents a more complex case that reflects medieval society's evolving relationship with monetary crime and economic security. His offense involved creating false silver coins that were virtually indistinguishable from legitimate currency, a skill that required considerable artistic talent and technical expertise. Medieval counterfeiting threatened the entire foundation of commercial trust that enabled trade and economic growth, making it a crime against society itself rather than any individual victim. Edmund's punishment will involve branding rather than death, marking him permanently as a criminal, while allowing him to continue living as a cautionary example. "The coins were perfect," Edmund says with obvious pride, apparently still impressed by his own craftsmanship despite its unfortunate consequences. Even the Royal Mint's inspector couldn't tell the difference until he weighed them. Medieval counterfeiters were often skilled craftsmen who turned their talents toward illegal applications, creating a law enforcement challenge that combined technical investigation with traditional criminal prosecution. The irony that Edmund's artistic abilities earned him punishment rather than reward probably isn't lost on him, though career counseling wasn't exactly available in 14th century vocational planning. The final case involves Margaret, the suspected witch, whose trial by ordeal concluded just hours ago with results that sealed her fate. Medieval witch trials represented a fascinating intersection of religious belief, legal procedure, and social control. Though the fascination diminishes considerably when you're holding the hot iron that will determine someone's guilt or innocence. Margaret failed the trial. Her burns became infected rather than healing cleanly, which medieval logic interpreted as proof of supernatural guilt. Modern medicine would point to poor sanitation and inadequate wound care, but medieval justice wasn't particularly interested in alternative explanations. "I never cursed anyone's cow," Margaret insists for probably the 100th time, her voice carrying the exhausted desperation of someone who knows that truth and justice don't always align in medieval legal proceedings. Historians still argue whether witch trials reflected genuine belief in supernatural crime or provided convenient methods for eliminating inconvenient women. But the distinction probably matters less to Margaret than it does to scholarly debate. Her punishment will involve burning, a death that medieval authorities considered appropriate for crimes against God and nature. The guards form a procession as you escort the condemned prisoners up the stone steps toward daylight and their final public appearance. Each step brings them closer to the moment when their earthly troubles will end, though medieval theology offered various opinions about what might follow afterward. The crowd's anticipation grows audible as the dungeon door opens, releasing the prisoners into morning sunlight that probably seems impossibly bright after weeks of underground darkness. You arrange the condemned in the order of their scheduled executions, with Thomas the horse thief first, followed by Marcus the murderer, then Edmund's branding, and finally Margaret's burning. Medieval protocol demanded specific sequencing that balanced dramatic impact with practical considerations. Hangings were relatively quick and simple, while burnings required extensive preparation and could take considerable time to complete properly. The crowd expects a well-organized show, and professional reputation requires delivering exactly that level of performance. The crowd has swelled to several hundred people by the time you guide the first prisoner up the scaffold steps, creating an amphitheater of humanity that stretches across the entire town square and spills into adjacent streets. Medieval executions were among the few events that could unite all social classes in shared experience, though the unity was somewhat undermined by the elaborate seating hierarchies that ensured nobles got better views than commoners. You scan the assembled faces, noting the mixture of anticipation, revulsion, and morbid curiosity that characterizes these gatherings. Apparently, human nature hasn't changed much since the invention of public punishment. Thomas the horse thief climbs the wooden steps with surprising dignity, his legs steadier now that the waiting has ended and the final act has begun. The crowd falls silent as he reaches the platform, hundreds of conversations stopping mid-sentence as attention focuses on the drama about to unfold. Medieval audiences were were surprisingly knowledgeable about execution procedures, having witnessed dozens of these events throughout their lives, and they expected professional competence from all participants. A botched hanging could turn public support against both the executioner and the justice system, making technical skill a matter of career survival. The town's official herald steps forward to read the formal charges and sentence, his voice carrying across the square with practiced authority. Medieval legal procedures required extensive verbal documentation, partly for record-keeping purposes, and partly to ensure that everyone understood exactly what crimes were being punished. Thomas Miller, also known as Thomas the Swift, you have been found guilty of stealing 3 horses belonging to Master Robert of Ashford, thereby depriving him of property valued at 15 silver marks, and threatening the agricultural productivity of his household. The specific monetary amounts always impressed you. Medieval justice was remarkably precise about economic damages, even when the punishments were anything but precise. A priest approaches to offer final spiritual comfort, carrying a wooden crucifix and speaking in Latin phrases that probably sound more comforting than they actually are under these circumstances. Medieval Christianity emphasized the importance of dying in a state of grace, making last-minute confession and absolution crucial elements of the execution ritual. Thomas whispers something that might be prayers or might be curses. The distinction becomes less important when you're about to have your neck snapped by a hemp rope. Historians still argue whether these religious components genuinely comforted the condemned or simply made the spectators feel better about watching people die. You position the noose around Thomas's neck with ceremonial precision, adjusting the knot placement to ensure a quick break rather than a slow strangulation. The crowd watches with rapt attention as you perform these technical preparations, many spectators probably taking mental notes in case they ever find themselves in similar circumstances. Medieval hanging was considered a merciful death when performed correctly, though the definition of correctly allowed for considerable variation in actual practice. Your professional reputation depends on consistency, so you've practiced the procedure until muscle memory takes over during the actual performance. The trapdoor mechanism requires careful coordination between you and the scaffold's assistant, a nervous young man who's clearly regretting his career choices, but needs the extra income that execution duty provides. Medieval employment opportunities were limited, and even unpleasant work was better than no work at all for families struggling to survive. He grips the release lever with white knuckles, waiting for your signal while trying not to look directly at Thomas's face. Professional executioners learned early that eye contact made the work infinitely more difficult, though complete emotional detachment remained elusive for anyone with a functioning conscience. Any final words, you ask, following the traditional protocol that gives condemned prisoners one last opportunity to address their community, confess additional crimes, or offer spiritual testimony. Medieval last words ranged from profound spiritual insights to bitter curses to practical concerns about unpaid debts and abandoned livestock. Thomas clears his throat and speaks in a voice that carries surprising strength despite his circumstances. I never meant harm to Master Robert's family. The horses were so fine, and my own children were so hungry. God forgive me, and may he provide better for my young ones than their father could manage. The crowd murmurs with sympathy at Thomas's words, reminding you that medieval audiences weren't bloodthirsty monsters, despite their enthusiasm for public executions. These were communities where everyone knew everyone else's business, and Thomas's family situation was probably common knowledge among the spectators. Medieval justice often punished desperation as harshly as malice, creating moral complexities that philosophical discussions could explore, but practical legal systems simply had to ignore. Someone steals horses, someone else pays the price. The equation was brutal in its simplicity, but necessary for maintaining social order. You nod to the assistant, who pulls the lever with emotion that's half professional duty and half violent flinch. The trapdoor drops with a wooden crash that echoes across the suddenly silent square, and Thomas's body falls through the opening with a final impact that you feel more than hear. The rope snaps taut with a sound like breaking kindling, and Thomas's struggles end almost immediately, a clean break that reflects well on your professional skills and provides the quick death that medieval mercy demanded. The crowd releases a collective breath that sounds like wind through autumn leaves, a mixture of relief and disappointment that always follows successful executions. The body hangs motionless now, swaying slightly in the morning breeze, while the crowd processes what they've just witnessed. Medieval execution protocol required leaving the corpse displayed for a specific period, both to confirm death and to maximize the deterrent effect on potential criminals. You check your pocket watch, a luxury item that few executioners could afford, but which proves invaluable for timing these public spectacles. Thomas will hang for exactly 1 hour before being cut down for burial, assuming his family can afford the fees required to reclaim his body for proper Christian interment. The crowd's attention now shifts to Marcus the murderer, who has watched his predecessor's fate with the pale fascination of someone seeing his own immediate future. Medieval prisoners were often forced to witness earlier executions in their sequence, a psychological cruelty that medieval justice either ignored or actively embraced as part of the punishment. Marcus's crime was more serious than Thomas's, which means his death will be correspondingly more dramatic. The sword rather than the rope. A beheading that requires significantly more skill and provides considerably more spectacular results for the assembled audience. Marcus the murderer kneels at the execution block with his hands bound behind his back, his neck positioned precisely over the worn groove where dozens of previous condemned souls have lost their heads to your sword. The massive oak block, stained dark with years of blood and weather, stands about 3 feet high, and provides the perfect angle for a clean beheading stroke. Medieval woodworking produced incredibly durable execution equipment, and this particular block has served the town faithfully for over 50 years without requiring replacement. You run your finger along the neck groove one final time, ensuring no splinters or rough edges will interfere with the sword's path. Professional pride demands attention to such details, even when the recipient won't be around to appreciate your craftsmanship. The execution sword weighs nearly 8 pounds and measures 4 feet from pommel to tip. Its blade forged specifically for the task of separating human heads from human bodies with maximum efficiency and minimum drama. Medieval swordsmiths understood that execution weapons required different characteristics than combat swords: less flexibility, more weight, and edges that could bite through bone and cartilage without chipping or dulling. Your particular blade was crafted by Master Heinrich of Cologne, whose reputation for quality extended throughout the Germanic regions, and whose waiting list typically ran 18 months for custom commissions. The investment represented nearly a year's wages, but professional tools are never cheap regardless of the profession. You raise the sword above your head in the traditional executioner's stance, feeling the familiar weight distribution that years of practice have burned into your muscle memory. The crowd falls silent as they recognize the ceremonial preparation. Hundreds of pairs of eyes focusing on the gleaming steel that will soon deliver medieval justice with brutal finality. Marcus keeps his eyes closed and his lips moving in what you assume are prayers, though the specific religious content matters less than the spiritual comfort it might provide during these final moments. Historians still argue whether condemned prisoners genuinely found peace in last-minute religious devotion, or simply grasped at psychological straws. But the distinction seems academic when someone's about to lose their head. The sword's arc begins with deliberate slowness, building speed and momentum as gravity joins your muscular effort to create the devastating impact needed for instant death. Medieval execution technique emphasized the importance of commitment. Hesitation or uncertainty could result in partial cuts that required multiple strokes to complete, creating unnecessary suffering and professional embarrassment. Your blade whistles through the morning air with the sound of impending finality, and the crowd holds its collective breath as steel approaches flesh with mathematical precision that years of practice have made nearly automatic. The impact occurs with a sound like an axe hitting wet firewood, followed immediately by the softer thud of Marcus's head hitting the scaffold platform and rolling toward the crowd like some macabre ball in a deadly game. Medieval physics and human anatomy combine to create remarkably predictable results when sharp metal meets human neck with sufficient force. Separation occurs almost instantaneously, with surprisingly little blood spray if the technique is properly executed. Marcus's body remains kneeling for several seconds after decapitation, a neurological phenomenon that never fails to fascinate medical observers and horrify squeamish spectators. The crowd erupts in a mixture of cheers and gasps, their bloodlust satisfied by the dramatic spectacle, while their humanity recoils from the graphic reality of violent death. Medieval audiences were considerably more accustomed to death and violence than modern spectators, but beheadings retained their power to shock even experienced execution watchers. Children who seemed eager for the show now hide behind their parents' legs, while adults debate the technical merits of your swordsmanship with the enthusiasm of sports fans analyzing a particularly impressive athletic performance. You wipe the blade clean with a cloth specifically designated for this purpose, removing the blood and tissue that could cause corrosion if left untreated. Medieval metallurgy produced excellent steel, but proper maintenance remained essential for preserving cutting edges and preventing rust damage. The cleaning ritual also provides a brief interlude that allows both you and the crowd to process what just occurred before moving on to the next scheduled execution. Professional executioners learned to pace these events carefully, maintaining dramatic momentum while providing psychological breathing room between particularly intense moments. Marcus's head stares sightlessly at the sky, its expression frozen in whatever final thought occupied his mind during those last seconds of consciousness. Medieval tradition required displaying severed heads as proof of completed justice and deterrent reminders of legal consequences, though the practice was gradually being abandoned in favor of less gruesome alternatives. You position the head carefully on a wooden spike that extends from the scaffold's front edge, ensuring maximum visibility for crowd members who might have missed the actual moment of separation. The site will remain there until sunset, when protocol allows for removal and burial preparations. The headless body has finally toppled forward, blood pooling around the neck stump in patterns that probably hold deep symbolic meaning for philosophers and theologians, but mainly represent cleanup challenges for scaffold maintenance crews. Medieval execution grounds required regular washing and scrubbing to prevent permanent staining and unpleasant odors that could discourage future attendance. The town employed a dedicated crew for post-execution cleanup, though recruitment for such positions typically required higher wages than most municipal services. Apparently, even desperate workers had limits on what they'd accept for regular income. Edmund the counterfeiter watches these proceedings with obvious terror, knowing that his own punishment approaches despite being somewhat less final than his predecessor's fates. Medieval audiences often found branding ceremonies more disturbing than executions, possibly because the condemned survived to display their marked flesh as permanent reminders of judicial punishment. The anticipation of pain can be worse than the anticipation of death, particularly when that pain will continue for years rather than ending with a single decisive stroke. Edmund's crime merited marking rather than killing, but the distinction probably provides little comfort when hot iron approaches human skin. You signal to your assistant to prepare the branding equipment, while you clean and store the execution sword in its designated case. Medieval protocol demanded specific procedures for transitioning between different types of punishment, and professional executioners were expected to handle multiple disciplines with equal competence. The crowd shifts restlessly as scaffold assistants remove Marcus's body and begin preparations for Edmund's branding. The change in execution methods requiring different equipment and staging arrangements. The morning sun has climbed higher, casting sharper shadows across the platform and intensifying the heat that will soon be applied to human flesh in the name of medieval justice. Your professional reputation depends on versatility. Executioners, who could only perform one type of punishment, found their employment opportunities severely limited in an era when legal creativity knew few bounds. Edmund's counterfeiting career is about to end with permanent facial scarring that will advertise his crimes to everyone he meets for the remainder of his natural life. The branding iron glows cherry red in the portable forge that your assistant has positioned at the scaffold's edge, its metal tip shaped into the letter C that will forever mark Edmund as a counterfeiter to anyone literate enough to recognize the symbol. Medieval justice favored punishments that served multiple purposes simultaneously: deterrent, identification, and public humiliation, combined into a single searing moment that would reshape both Edmund's face and his future prospects. The iron's heat distorts the air around it in wavering patterns that make the crowd seem to dance with anticipation, though the actual dancing will probably be Edmund's when hot metal meets living skin. Edmund struggles against his restraints with the desperate energy of someone who's finally realized that abstract legal concepts are about to become intensely personal physical experiences. Medieval binding techniques were remarkably effective at preventing escape, while still allowing sufficient movement for the punishment to be properly administered. 2 guards hold his shoulders steady, while a third secures his head in position, ensuring that the brand will be applied precisely to his forehead, where maximum visibility can be achieved. The crowd presses closer for better views of the upcoming spectacle, their morbid curiosity apparently extending beyond simple executions to include creative judicial mutilation. "Please," Edmund gasps, his voice carrying across the square with the desperate authority of impending pain. "I'll never make another false coin. I swear on my mother's grave and the holy saints, and whatever else you want me to swear on." Medieval prisoners often attempted last-minute negotiations, as if criminal justice were some sort of commercial transaction open to renegotiation based on improved terms and conditions. Unfortunately for Edmund, medieval legal systems weren't particularly interested in plea bargaining. Once the formal sentencing had been completed and the public spectacle had begun, you grip the branding iron's wooden handle and lift it from the coals, testing its temperature against a piece of cloth that immediately bursts into flames, perfect heat for creating permanent scars, without causing excessive tissue damage that might lead to infection and death. Medieval medicine understood surprisingly little about wound care and sterilization, but practical experience had taught executioners the optimal temperatures for various branding applications. Too cool, and the mark would be shallow, and temporary, too hot, and the resulting burns could prove fatal, defeating the purpose of non-lethal punishment. The crowd falls silent as you approach Edmund's face with the glowing iron. Hundreds of people collectively holding their breath in anticipation of the sizzling sound that everyone knows is coming. Medieval audiences were surprisingly sophisticated about the technical aspects of public punishment, having witnessed enough brandings to recognize proper technique and judge professional competence. Edmund's eyes roll wildly as the heat approaches his forehead, and somewhere in the crowd, a woman's voice calls out, "God forgive us all," though whether she's referring to Edmund's crimes or the community's response remains unclear. The iron touches skin with a hiss like bacon hitting a hot pan, followed immediately by Edmund's scream that echoes off the surrounding buildings with the pure anguish of someone discovering exactly how much pain the human nervous system can transmit. Medieval branding required holding the iron against flesh for precisely the right duration, long enough to create permanent scarring, but brief enough to avoid destroying too much tissue. You count silently to 3 before lifting the iron away, revealing the letter C burned into Edmund's forehead with professional precision that will remain clearly visible for the rest of his natural life. Edmund's sobbing mingles with the crowd's satisfied murmur as they inspect your handiwork and debate its artistic merits with the casual enthusiasm of art critics examining a new painting. Medieval audiences appreciated craftsmanship in all its forms, including judicial scarification that required both technical skill and steady nerves under pressure. The brand's edges are clean and uniform, with minimal peripheral burning that might obscure the letter's readability. Exactly the kind of quality work that maintains professional reputation and ensures continued employment in the competitive field of medieval punishment administration. The guards release Edmund's restraints and help him to his feet, though his legs remain shaky from the trauma, and his face streams with tears that wash over the fresh burn in patterns that probably sting worse than the original branding. Medieval medical care for punishment injuries was minimal at best, typically consisting of rough bandages and prayers for divine healing. Edmund will spend the next several weeks fighting infection and hoping that his facial wound heals cleanly enough to avoid permanent disfigurement beyond the intended scarring, a hope that medieval hygiene standards made somewhat optimistic. Margaret, the accused witch, has watched these proceedings with the wide-eyed terror of someone who knows that her own punishment will make Edmund's branding seem like a minor inconvenience by comparison. Medieval witch trials culminated in burning, a death that authorities considered appropriate for crimes against God and nature, but which modern sensibilities recognize as among the most brutal execution methods ever devised. The faggots and kindling, stacked around the wooden post at the scaffold's far end, represent Margaret's final destination, though the journey there will involve considerable ceremony and religious ritual. Your assistant begins preparing the burning equipment, while you tend to the branding iron's cleaning and storage, professional maintenance routines that continue regardless of the human drama unfolding around them. Medieval executioners learned to compartmentalize their work, treating each punishment as a separate technical challenge, rather than dwelling on the cumulative psychological impact of their career choices. The afternoon sun beats down on the scaffold platform with increasing intensity, adding natural heat to the artificial fires that will soon consume Margaret's body in the name of medieval justice. The crowd's mood has shifted from excited anticipation to something approaching religious solemnity as they contemplate the upcoming burning, recognizing that witch executions carried different spiritual implications than ordinary criminal punishments. Medieval Christianity taught that witchcraft represented direct rebellion against God's authority, making witch burning both legal execution and religious purification ceremony. Margaret will die not just as punishment for her alleged crimes, but as a symbolic victory of divine order over supernatural chaos, assuming, of course, that the charges against her are actually true. Historians still argue whether medieval witch trials reflected genuine belief in supernatural crime, or provided convenient methods for eliminating inconvenient women who threatened social stability through independence, knowledge, or simple bad luck. Margaret's case involved the traditional accusations: cursing livestock, causing crop failures, and consorting with demonic forces that normal Christian women would naturally avoid. The evidence consisted mainly of neighborhood gossip, suspicious coincidences, and the trial by ordeal that sealed her fate when her burns became infected rather than healing cleanly. The preparations continue with methodical precision as your assistant arranges the kindling for optimal burning characteristics, ensuring sufficient airflow for sustained combustion, while providing enough fuel density to maintain lethal temperatures throughout the execution process. Medieval fire management was surprisingly sophisticated, with techniques developed through centuries of experience in everything from cooking to metalworking to human cremation. Margaret's death will require careful attention to fuel management and wind direction, factors that could mean the difference between quick death and prolonged agony. The afternoon heat has intensified as Margaret is led to the wooden post, surrounded by carefully arranged bundles of dry wood and straw. Her final walk, accompanied by a priest who offers continuous prayers for her soul, while the crowd watches with the fascinated horror reserved for society's most extreme punishments. Medieval witch burnings represented the intersection of legal justice and religious purification, creating ceremonies that were simultaneously judicial execution and spiritual warfare against supernatural evil. Margaret's hands are bound to the post behind her back, positioning her body for maximum exposure to the flames that will soon engulf the entire structure in what authorities hope will be swift, divine justice. The kindling catches fire with surprising speed once you apply the torch, flames spreading through the dry wood, and straw with eager hunger that quickly transforms the neat stack into a roaring inferno. Medieval fire technology was remarkably effective for destroying human bodies, though the process rarely proceeded as quickly or mercifully as authorities publicly claimed. Margaret's screams rise above the crackling flames and crowd noise, creating a sound that will haunt your dreams for months despite years of professional experience with various forms of judicial killing. Even experienced executioners found witch burnings more psychologically challenging than conventional executions, perhaps because the prolonged nature of death by fire allowed too much time for contemplating the humanity of the condemned. The crowd begins to disperse as Margaret's struggles cease, and the flames consume her body with the methodical efficiency that medieval justice demanded from all its procedures. Some spectators remain to watch until only ashes remain, but most families with children depart once the immediate spectacle concludes and the reality of prolonged burning becomes apparent. Medieval audiences had strong stomachs for violence, but even they recognized appropriate limits for what young eyes should witness during their moral education. The morning's entertainment has concluded, and normal town life must resume despite the lingering smell of burned flesh that will take hours to dissipate completely. Your assistant begins the cleanup process while you supervise the proper disposal of remains according to medieval protocol and religious requirements. Thomas, the horse thief's body, has been claimed by his family for burial in the churchyard, assuming they can afford the fees required for consecrated ground interment. Marcus, the murderer's head and body, will be reunited for burial in the potter's field reserved for executed criminals, while his family begins the long process of social rehabilitation that medieval justice imposed on relatives of serious criminals. The scaffold platform requires thorough washing to remove blood stains and tissue remnants that could attract scavengers or create unpleasant odors for future executions. Medieval record-keeping demanded detailed documentation of all judicial proceedings, and your responsibilities include filing reports with both secular and religious authorities, who maintain separate archives for legal and spiritual purposes. The official execution log requires precise notation of times, methods, and outcomes for each punishment administered, creating permanent records that medieval bureaucracy used for everything from statistical analysis to precedent establishment. Your handwriting may not win any penmanship awards, but legibility matters more than beauty when documenting the precise moment when human lives end at the hands of state-sanctioned violence. The town's official coroner arrives to examine the bodies and certify that justice has been properly administered according to legal requirements and medical standards, such as they are in an era when anatomical knowledge comes mainly from battlefield experience and execution observations. Medieval medicine was surprisingly systematic about death documentation, though their understanding of human physiology would horrify modern medical professionals. The coroner's report will join your execution log in the official archives, creating redundant documentation that medieval legal systems used to prevent disputes about whether punishments were correctly administered. Edmund the counterfeiter has been released to begin his new life as a marked man, his forehead bearing the permanent C that will identify him to everyone he meets for the remainder of his days. Medieval social rehabilitation was largely a do-it-yourself affair, with branded criminals expected to find legitimate employment despite the obvious challenges their facial advertising created. Some towns had informal support systems for marked criminals, while others simply hoped that permanent identification would prevent repeat offenses through social pressure and economic exclusion theories that worked better in legal philosophy than practical application. The scaffold's permanent fixtures require maintenance attention after each execution day, ensuring that the platform, trapdoor mechanism, and burning post remain in proper working condition for future judicial needs. Medieval civic infrastructure included surprisingly sophisticated execution equipment that could last for decades with proper care and regular maintenance. Your tools also need cleaning and sharpening before storage, professional routines that continue regardless of personal feelings about the day's work or its impact on the condemned and their families. Margaret's ashes are collected and disposed of according to religious protocol for suspected witches, typically involving scattering in unconsecrated locations to prevent any possibility of martyrdom or shrine creation. Medieval Christianity took seriously the spiritual implications of how executed witches were treated after death, fearing that improper disposal might allow demonic forces to continue operating through physical remains. The theological complexities probably matter less to Margaret than they do to church authorities, but medieval legal systems operated according to religious principles, whether individual participants understood or agreed with them. The crowd has mostly returned to normal activities by the time you finish your official duties and begin packing your equipment for the journey home to your cottage on the town's outskirts. Medieval life continued its daily routines despite periodic interruptions for public executions, demonstrating the remarkable human capacity for adapting to even the most violent social institutions. Children who watched this morning's proceedings will probably play execution games this afternoon, turning judicial murder into recreational activity with the casual resilience that only youth can muster in the face of adult brutality. Your leather satchel contains the clean, sharp tools that will remain ready for the next official summons, whenever it might arrive. Medieval crime rates ensured fairly regular employment for professional executioners, though the unpredictable timing meant maintaining other income sources during slow periods. Some executioners worked as butchers, leveraging their anatomical knowledge and steady hands for more socially acceptable applications, while others offered services as surgeons despite the obvious irony of healing people between scheduled sessions of killing them professionally. The late afternoon sun casts long shadows across the empty scaffold as you take one final look at the platform where 4 human lives encountered medieval justice with varying degrees of finality. Tomorrow, this space will return to its normal function as a market square where merchants hawk their wares and children play games, the morning's violence already fading into community memory like dozens of previous execution days. Medieval society possessed remarkable capacity for compartmentalizing death and continuing with the business of living, a survival skill that modern comfort has largely rendered unnecessary, but which remains visible in historical records of judicial killing. The walk home provides necessary psychological distance from the day's work, each step taking you further from the public spectacle and closer to the solitary reflection that medieval executioners required for maintaining whatever sanity their profession allowed. Your cottage sits approximately half a mile from the town center, far enough to provide privacy, but close enough for officials to summon you when judicial needs arise unexpectedly. The familiar path winds through fields where farmers are concluding their own daily labors, their work creating life, while yours destroys it, a contrast that never loses its philosophical weight, regardless of how many execution days you've completed professionally. Evening air carries the scent of cooking fires and evening meals, normal domestic activities that remind you that most people spend their days in pursuit of survival and comfort rather than the administration of legal death. Medieval society depended on countless individual contributions to maintain community stability, from farming and craftsmanship to commerce and governance, with your particular specialty representing a necessary but distinctly minority career path. The sounds of children playing and families gathering for supper create a soundtrack of normalcy that helps wash away the morning's screams and the afternoon's crackling flames. Your cottage's interior welcomes you with the familiar comfort of personal space, arranged according to individual preferences rather than public expectations or professional requirements. The main room serves multiple functions: workspace for tool maintenance, dining area for solitary meals, and study where you maintain the records that medieval bureaucracy demands from all official positions. Your writing desk bears the accumulated paperwork of years in professional service. Execution logs, correspondence with other executioners, and the occasional legal inquiry from authorities investigating procedural questions or appeals from condemned prisoners' families. The day's official documentation requires completion before you can consider your professional duties fulfilled, and medieval record-keeping standards demand precision that rivals modern bureaucratic requirements. Your execution log entry for today records the essential details. 17th day of June, year of our Lord 1347. Thomas Miller, horse theft, hanged. Marcus Blackwood, murder, beheaded. Edmund Cooper, counterfeiting, branded. Margaret Wise, witchcraft, burned. All sentences carried out according to law and custom. Whether clear, crowd estimated at 400 persons. No complications or irregularities observed. The clinical language transforms morning's human drama into administrative data that future historians will use to understand medieval justice systems and their social impact. Tool maintenance occupies the next hour as you clean, inspect, and sharpen each implement used during today's proceedings. Professional routines that ensure continued effectiveness and prevent the equipment failures that could compromise future executions. The hanging rope receives particular attention since hemp fibers can weaken unpredictably, and a broken noose during public execution would create professional embarrassment and unnecessary suffering for the condemned. Medieval craftsmanship produced remarkably durable goods, but proper maintenance remained essential for preserving both function and reputation in any skilled trade. Your execution sword requires especially careful attention after today's beheading, its blade examined for nicks or dulling that could affect performance during future use. The steel gleams under candlelight as you work the whetstone along its edge with practiced motions that restore the razor sharpness essential for clean decapitation. Medieval metallurgy produced excellent weapons when properly cared for, and your sword represents both significant financial investment and irreplaceable professional tool that must remain in perfect condition regardless of personal feelings about its applications. The branding irons need cooling and cleaning before storage, their metal tips still retaining heat from this afternoon's application to Edmund's forehead. Medieval ironworking created tools that could maintain consistent temperatures and precise shapes under the extreme conditions that judicial punishment required. The letter C branded into the iron's tip will mark countless future counterfeiters, assuming crime rates continue their current patterns and legal procedures remain consistent with established traditions. Professional executioners maintained equipment that outlasted individual careers, creating tool collections that passed from master to apprentice across generations of judicial service. Correspondence from fellow executioners awaits your attention in a wooden box where you store professional communications and trade information that helps maintain standards across different jurisdictions. Medieval executioners formed informal networks that shared techniques, equipment recommendations, and employment opportunities throughout the various kingdoms and principalities that comprised European political organization. Today's mail includes a letter from Master Johann in Frankfurt describing new hanging techniques that reportedly improve consistency, and an inquiry from the Bordeaux executioner seeking recommendations for sword maintenance in humid climates. The evening meal consists of bread, cheese, and ale consumed in solitary contemplation while reviewing the day's events and their implications for your professional reputation and personal conscience. Medieval executioners ate alone more often than not, partly from social ostracism and partly from preference for privacy when processing the psychological impact of their work. The food tastes adequate, though unremarkable, nutrition serving functional rather than recreational purposes when appetite struggles against memories of morning screams and afternoon flames. Your personal library includes technical manuals on execution procedures, religious texts that address the spiritual implications of judicial killing, and secular works that explore the philosophical questions surrounding state-sanctioned death. Medieval literacy rates were low even among skilled professionals, but executioners often learned to read in order to study their craft and understand the legal frameworks that governed their work. Tonight, you select a treatise on Christian approaches to capital punishment, seeking intellectual frameworks that might help reconcile professional duties with personal moral concerns. The evening light fades gradually through your single window, marking the transition from professional obligations to personal time where individual conscience must grapple with the day's actions and their cumulative impact on your soul. Medieval Christianity taught that all work served God's purposes when performed with proper intentions, but executioners faced particular challenges in finding spiritual comfort for careers built on ending human lives. Prayer comes easier some nights than others, depending on whether the days condemned seemed genuinely deserving of their punishments, or simply unlucky enough to encounter medieval justice at its most unforgiving. Historians still argue whether medieval executioners were psychologically different from other professionals, or simply adapted to their circumstances through necessity and social conditioning. But the question probably matters less than the practical reality of maintaining professional competence while preserving personal humanity. Tomorrow may bring new summons for judicial services, or it may allow time for equipment maintenance and skill practice that keeps your abilities sharp during slower periods. Medieval employment was unpredictable at best, and executioners learned to balance professional readiness with personal recovery between periods of intensive activity. The simple meal of brown bread, hard cheese, and weak ale serves as much for routine comfort as nutritional necessity, consumed at the wooden table that doubles as your writing desk and equipment maintenance workspace during different parts of your daily schedule. Medieval cuisine was generally unremarkable for common people, and executioners rarely received social invitations that might improve their dining options through community fellowship or professional networking. The bread comes from Baker Wilhelm, who sells to you without conversation, but at least doesn't cross himself or spit when conducting business. Small courtesies that you've learned to appreciate after years of social isolation that your profession inevitably creates. The cottage's single room echoes with the sounds of solitary living, the scrape of knife against wooden plate, the soft crackle of fire in the small hearth, and the occasional creak of settling timber that reminds you of the scaffold sounds during this morning's executions. Medieval architecture wasn't designed for sound insulation, and even your isolated dwelling can't completely block the distant noise of town life continuing its normal patterns despite the day's judicial interruptions. Families are gathering for their own evening meals, sharing food and conversation that your profession makes largely impossible to experience personally. A knock at your door interrupts the quiet meal, surprising you since few people visit executioners voluntarily, and official summons typically arrive during daylight hours when legal business is normally conducted. Medieval social customs included complex protocols for interacting with executioners, ranging from complete avoidance to formal acknowledgement, depending on individual attitudes and professional necessity. You approach the door cautiously, wondering if tonight's visitor brings new work, seeks information about today's proceedings, or perhaps represents some form of community business that requires your professional input. The caller proves to be Father Benedict from the town's main church, a middle-aged priest whose theological duties occasionally intersect with your judicial responsibilities when condemned prisoners require spiritual guidance before execution. Medieval Christianity maintained complicated relationships with capital punishment, supporting its necessity while struggling with its spiritual implications for both victims and practitioners. Father Benedict enters your cottage with obvious discomfort but determined purpose, carrying a small wooden cross and wearing the expression of someone fulfilling unwelcome pastoral obligations. Master Wilhelm, he begins with formal courtesy that distances personal feelings from professional interaction. I've come to inquire about your spiritual welfare following today's proceedings, particularly the witch burning that concluded this afternoon's judicial activities. Medieval clergy were expected to provide pastoral care for all community members, including those whose professions created special spiritual challenges or social complications. The priest's visit represents genuine concern rather than mere duty, though distinguishing between the two motivations probably matters less than his willingness to engage with questions that most people prefer avoiding entirely. You offer Father Benedict ale and a seat at your table, medieval hospitality customs, applying even to conversations about judicial killing and its impact on individual souls seeking salvation. The priest accepts both offerings with grateful acknowledgement, apparently recognizing that these discussions require time and comfort rather than hurried exchanges conducted at doorsteps. Medieval theological education included extensive training in moral philosophy and ethical reasoning, but practical applications often proved more challenging than academic theory when dealing with real situations involving actual people and their complicated lives. The woman Margaret, Father Benedict continues after tasting the ale and settling into his chair, maintained her innocence until the flames consumed her voice entirely. Such protests are common among the condemned, but her particular vehemence suggests either exceptional defiance or possible genuineness that troubles my conscience regarding today's proceedings. Medieval witch trials often produced ambiguous results that left both participants and observers questioning whether justice had been properly administered or innocent people had died due to flawed procedures and insufficient evidence. The conversation that follows explores theological territory that you've navigated countless times during your career. The relationship between earthly justice and divine will, the spiritual implications of killing in service to legal authority, and the personal moral responsibilities of individuals who implement society's death sentences. Medieval Christianity offered various frameworks for understanding these questions, though definitive answers remained elusive even for trained theologians with extensive philosophical education. Father Benedict listens thoughtfully to your responses, while offering insights from his own pastoral experience with crime, punishment, and human nature's complex motivations. Historians still argue whether medieval executioners were necessary servants of divine justice or unfortunate victims of social systems that required someone to perform unpleasant duties for community benefit. The priest observes, while refilling his ale cup from your small pitcher. Perhaps the distinction matters less than how individual practitioners conduct themselves within their assigned roles and maintain their spiritual health despite professional challenges. Medieval moral philosophy emphasized personal agency and individual responsibility, even within social structures that limited individual choices and created ethical dilemmas that had no perfect solutions. The discussion continues as evening darkness settles around your cottage, candlelight creating a warm circle that contains this unlikely friendship between society's death dealer and God's representative on earth. Father Benedict visits several times each year, usually following particularly difficult executions or during religious seasons when spiritual reflection intensifies community attention to moral questions and individual conscience. These conversations provide rare opportunities for intellectual exchange and emotional support that your profession otherwise makes nearly impossible to obtain through normal social channels. Medieval clerical training included extensive preparation for counseling individuals whose work created special spiritual burdens, from soldiers returning from battlefield killing to judges sentencing criminals to death, to executioners implementing legal sentences that ended human lives. Father Benedict's pastoral skills have been refined through years of experience with moral complexity and human fallibility, qualities that prove invaluable when discussing the intersection of professional duty and personal faith with someone whose career requires taking life rather than preserving it. The priest eventually prepares to leave, gathering his cloak and cross while offering final reassurances about your spiritual standing and the legitimacy of your professional service within God's larger plan for human justice and social order. Medieval theology taught that all legitimate authority derived from divine sources, making properly conducted executions acts of religious obedience rather than personal murder theories that provided intellectual comfort even when emotional questions remained unresolved. Father Benedict's blessing carries weight that helps counterbalance the social isolation and moral ambiguity that your profession creates. Tomorrow may bring new challenges or welcome respite. The priest observes as he prepares to depart into the night darkness that surrounds your cottage like a physical manifestation of social separation. Either way, remember that your service protects innocent people from criminal violence while providing opportunities for condemned souls to prepare for divine judgment through confession and repentance. Medieval Christianity emphasized redemptive possibilities even in judicial killing, viewing executions as final opportunities for spiritual reconciliation rather than simply punitive endings to criminal careers. The cottage returns to solitary quiet after Father Benedict's departure, leaving you alone with thoughts, memories, and the persistent question of whether today's deaths served justice or simply satisfied social demands for violent responses to criminal behavior. Medieval moral philosophy offered frameworks for understanding these issues, but personal experience ultimately required individual reconciliation between professional duties and spiritual welfare that no external authority could provide completely. The candle flame flickers in the evening breeze that seeps through gaps in your cottage walls, casting dancing shadows that seem to move with the restless energy of unquiet souls seeking peace that medieval Christianity promised, but earthly experience often failed to deliver. The silence following Father Benedict's departure feels heavier than usual, weighted with questions about Margaret's final words and the possibility that today's witch burning eliminated an innocent woman whose only crimes were bad luck and community suspicion. Medieval justice systems operated with confidence that sometimes exceeded their actual accuracy, creating situations where legal procedures produced results that individual participants privately questioned. Your personal prayer book lies open on the wooden table, its pages worn smooth by years of nightly consultation as you've sought spiritual guidance for the moral complexities that professional execution creates in medieval Christian society. Tonight, you turn to familiar passages about divine justice and human authority, reading words that have provided comfort during previous crises of conscience, but tonight seem inadequate for the specific doubts that Margaret's burning has created. The theological arguments for capital punishment sound convincing in academic discussion, but feel less certain when you remember the sound of her voice proclaiming innocence until the flames made speech impossible. Medieval Christianity taught that God worked through earthly authorities to maintain social order and punish criminal behavior, making properly conducted executions acts of divine, rather than human murder. The doctrine provided intellectual framework for understanding your profession's place in cosmic justice, but practical application often proved more challenging than theoretical discussion when dealing with specific cases and individual conscience. Tonight, the familiar theological comfort feels distant, overwhelmed by sensory memories of smoke and screams that academic philosophy wasn't designed to address directly. cottage's stone walls seem to press closer in the candlelight, creating physical manifestation of the social isolation that your profession imposes through community fear and moral ambiguity that even sympathetic neighbors find difficult to navigate successfully. Medieval executioners lived on society's margins by necessity, essential for community function, but too associated with death and violence for comfortable social integration. The loneliness becomes more oppressive during evening hours when other families gather for shared meals and conversation, while you process the day's psychological impact in solitary contemplation. Historians still argue whether medieval executioners were fundamentally different from other professionals, or simply adapted to their circumstances through necessity and social conditioning. But the question matters less tonight than the practical reality of maintaining personal humanity while professionally administering death sentences. The technical skills required for clean executions demand emotional detachment that sometimes extends beyond professional boundaries into personal relationships and individual conscience. Finding balance between necessary professional distance and continued human empathy requires constant effort that becomes exhausting over years of career service. Your execution log sits beside the prayer book, its clinical entries documenting today's judicial proceedings with bureaucratic precision that transforms human drama into administrative data for medieval record-keeping purposes. The stark contrast between official documentation and personal experience highlights the gap between social systems and individual participation that creates moral tension for anyone whose work directly implements community justice through violence. Reading your own professional writing feels like examining someone else's career. The emotional distance necessary for accurate record keeping, creating psychological separation from the human reality of judicial killing. The small wooden crosses you've carved during quiet evenings fill a leather pouch beside your bed, each one destined for anonymous placement at executed prisoners' graves as private ritual that helps reconcile professional duties with personal faith. Medieval Christianity emphasized the importance of prayer for the dead and remembrance of human dignity, even in criminal punishment. Values that your private memorial practice attempts to honor despite official procedures that often treat executed bodies as disposed waste rather than former human beings deserving continued spiritual consideration. Tomorrow's uncertainty weighs heavily during these evening reflections, since medieval legal systems provided irregular employment that could range from weeks of inactivity to multiple executions in single days, depending on crime rates and judicial schedules. Professional executioners learned to maintain readiness for sudden summons while finding productive activities during slower periods that helped preserve both technical skills and psychological stability. The unpredictability created additional stress beyond the actual execution duties, making personal planning difficult and social relationships nearly impossible to maintain consistently. The fire in your small hearth burns lower as the evening progresses, its diminishing light creating deeper shadows that mirror the spiritual darkness that sometimes accompanies careers built on ending human lives. Medieval fuel was precious enough that conservation became necessary during quiet evenings, but tonight the growing darkness seems appropriate for contemplating mortality and individual responsibility within social systems that require some people to kill others in service to community welfare. The dying flames remind you of this afternoon's witch burning and Margaret's claims of innocence that may have died with her in the town square. Your professional reputation depends on consistent technical competence and emotional reliability that allows legal authorities to count on your services when judicial needs arise unexpectedly. Medieval executioners who developed drinking problems or suffered psychological breakdowns found their employment opportunities disappearing quickly, since unreliable performance in capital punishment created both practical problems and public relations disasters for legal systems. Maintaining professional stability requires careful attention to personal welfare and spiritual health that becomes challenging when your work involves regular exposure to extreme violence and human suffering. The cottage's single window frames a view of distant town lights where normal families conclude their evening activities without contemplating the moral implications of judicial killing or the psychological burdens that professional death administration creates for individual practitioners. Medieval society depended on functional specialization that allowed most people to avoid direct participation in legal violence while benefiting from its deterrent effects on criminal behavior. You occupy a necessary but lonely position in this social division of labor, essential for community welfare, but isolated from community fellowship by the nature of your professional duties. Sleep approaches slowly on execution nights, delayed by mental reviews of technical performance and moral justification that help process the psychological impact of your work while ensuring continued professional competence. Medieval executioners developed various coping strategies for managing career stress and maintaining personal stability, from religious devotion to alcohol consumption to philosophical study that provided intellectual frameworks for understanding their social role. Tonight requires all these resources as you prepare for rest that may or may not provide escape from the day's haunting memories and tomorrow's uncertain demands. The candle burns down to its final inches as you prepare for sleep, its wax pooling on the wooden holder in patterns that remind you of the morning's blood stains and afternoon's scattered ashes, connections that your mind makes automatically after years of professional association with death and its various manifestations. Medieval nights were truly dark without modern lighting, creating cocoons of solitude that either provided peaceful rest or amplified psychological burdens, depending on individual circumstances and daily experiences. Tonight, the darkness feels welcome, offering potential escape from visual reminders of judicial proceedings that your conscience continues processing despite your body's growing exhaustion. You kneel beside your bed for evening prayers, a ritual that has remained constant throughout your career, regardless of daily events or personal doubts about spiritual questions that professional execution inevitably raises. The familiar Latin phrases provide comfort through repetition, even when their theological implications feel less certain than usual. Words that connect your individual struggle with centuries of Christian tradition and communal faith. Medieval spirituality offered structured approaches to moral complexity that helped individuals navigate ethical challenges while maintaining connection to divine purpose and community values. The straw mattress accepts your weight with familiar creaking that signals the transition from active duty to passive rest, though genuine sleep often requires considerable time and effort after particularly difficult execution days. Medieval bedding was simple but adequate for basic comfort, and your cottage's isolation ensures freedom from external noises that might disturb whatever rest your conscience allows. The pillow, stuffed with feathers from geese you raised and slaughtered yourself, cradles your head while your mind slowly releases its grip on the day's events and their implications for your soul's ultimate welfare. Margaret's final words echo in the growing quiet. I never cursed anyone's cow, never harmed any child, never consorted with devils or spirits. May God forgive you all for what you do to innocent people in the name of justice. Medieval witch trials often produced such protestations, but something in her voice carried conviction that distinguished genuine innocence from desperate lies told by guilty parties facing inevitable punishment. Historians still argue whether medieval legal procedures were designed to uncover truth or simply provide community catharsis through ritualized violence. But the distinction matters less than the possibility that today's proceedings eliminated someone whose only crime was living in an era when suspicion could prove fatal. The cottage settles around you with the subtle sounds of nighttime, wood expanding and contracting with temperature changes, the distant call of an owl hunting in nearby fields, and the soft whisper of wind through the thatched roof that provides adequate shelter from medieval weather patterns. These natural sounds help wash away the artificial noises of human justice, scaffold creaking, rope snapping, flames crackling, replacing them with rhythms that existed long before legal systems developed and will continue long after current political arrangements fade into historical memory. The leather pouch containing wooden crosses sits within arm's reach, ready for tomorrow's anonymous grave visits that have become personal tradition for honoring the humanity of condemned prisoners, regardless of their crimes or legal status. Medieval Christianity emphasized the universal need for spiritual remembrance and divine mercy, values that your private memorial practice attempts to honor even when official procedures treat executed bodies as disposed waste. The small ritual provides psychological comfort and spiritual structure that helps balance professional duties with personal faith in community systems that sometimes produce questionable results. breathing gradually slows as physical exhaustion overcomes mental activity, the body's need for rest eventually overruling conscience's demand for continued moral examination of professional duties and their implications. Medieval life was physically demanding for everyone, and executioners faced additional stresses that made adequate sleep essential for maintaining both technical competence and psychological stability. Tomorrow may bring new challenges or welcome respite, but either possibility requires adequate rest, and whatever peace your conscience can achieve through prayer and philosophical acceptance. Rest well now. Good night.